When I was in 6th grade, I had this friend, Jamie. At school, I didn't notice too much out of the ordinary about Jamie, but now looking back, I realized that she faced a lot of hardship. She would tell me things like how she had a fungus on her feet from not wearing clean socks, and that she constantly got headaches because of her eyesight. She probably should have had glasses. For some reason, none of this set off any red flags in my 11-year-old brain, and I jumped at the chance to come to her house for a sleepover. Jamie invited me to come over at the beginning of the school week. It was only after I received this invitation that she started to tell me more about her home life. She lived in a duplex with her mom and teenage brother. Her dad lived on the other side of the duplex. Her parents were divorced. I thought it was weird that the dad still lived in the same house as the mom even though they were divorced, but I didn't press the matter. Jamie went on to tell me that her father had recently held a gun to her brother's head during a heated argument. This immediately set off alarm bells in my head. I'd never been around guns before. But again, my 11-year-old brain didn't think to tell my mom about what Jamie had told me. I was just excited to be going to a sleepover. Friday rolled around, and my mom dropped me off at Jamie's house. The neighborhood was pretty run down, but not terrible. I walked in the house and met Jamie's mom. She was super nice and welcoming. Jamie's dad was also there, and I was a little afraid of meeting him, but all of that was forgotten as Jamie and I went outside to play in the woods in her backyard. After a little while of running around in the woods, Jamie's dad called us inside. He needed to run an errand, and since Jamie's mom had gone out, we had to go with the dad so we would not be home alone. Jamie and I hopped in the back seat and off we went. We drove to a neighborhood, the dad parked the car, and walked inside a house. I can't remember how long we sat outside that house waiting, but it was not until many years later that I realized her dad was picking up drugs. I don't know what kind, I just remember Jamie telling me her dad did some kind of drug. Again, 11-year-old brain. It gives me chills now thinking about two young girls sitting outside while who knows what went on in that house. After that, the dad took us back to Jamie's house, and Jamie and I had a pretty fun evening. Jamie's brother's girlfriend took us to a theme park where Jamie's brother worked and we got to ride around in the bumper boats for free. Jamie and I were both exhausted when we got back to the house, and we almost immediately fell asleep on the couch in the living room. Bang! I woke up with a start at 7 a.m. Jamie's dad was storming around the kitchen, slamming cabinet doors and screaming, "Where's my fucking coffee?" The kitchen was connected to the living room where we were sleeping, and I didn't want the dad to see that I was awake, so I kept my eyes shut and pretended to be asleep. I was terrified, remembering the recent incident with the gun. The dad then walked into the mother's room, also connected to the living room, and was screaming at her about the coffee. The mom was half asleep, scolding the dad. I heard her say that poor girl is probably out there pretending to be asleep. You've probably scared her. My heart sank. Why did she have to mention me? The dad lowered his voice a bit, but he was still fuming about not knowing where his coffee is. After a few more agonizing minutes, the dad left for work, and the house was quiet again. I did not go back to sleep, and I was very happy when my mom came to get me. It was only after my mom picked me up that I told her everything, from the toe fungus, to the gun incident, to the coffee incident. She was obviously upset, but not mad at me. She told me very sternly that I would not be spending the night at Jamie's house again, but Jamie could come to our house if she wanted. Jamie moved schools before we started 7th grade. I never saw or heard from her again. The only piece of news I heard about her was a few years later. I was in high school at this point, and my mom found a newspaper article that stated Jamie's mom had set their duplex on fire in order to get insurance money, and that Jamie's mom had been arrested. There was no mention of Jamie or her father. So suffice to say, Jamie, wherever you are, I hope you're okay. I was 10 years old, just started 5th grade. I made a new friend in school, Yanni. My parents allowed me to go for a sleepover at her house. They met her mom once. My mom and dad were pretty laid back because I was their last kid. My sisters were 9 to 13 years older than me. So my mom dropped me off, said hello to Yanni's mom, and left. Me and Yanni started playing karaoke when her mom decided she was going to leave. She said goodbye to us, gave us kisses on the cheek, and I remember thinking she smelled like black licorice. Me and Yanni were left to do whatever we wanted for the next 5 hours. Yanni's older sister came home around 1 a.m. and told us that we should go to bed because we were falling asleep on the couch, so we went into Yanni's room and laid in her bed. Later that night, I can't be sure what time because it was pitch dark, Yanni's mom came home. I woke up to a pounding sound on Yanni's bedroom door. I started yelling in fear when I felt a hand over my mouth. It was Yanni telling me to be quiet and pretend to be asleep. But at that moment, it was too late. Her mom had kicked the door open, stormed over to the bed, and grabbed Yanni's face. She began screaming at Yanni because we accidentally left the TV on. I was trying to hide under the covers, but she saw me. She began slamming her fists on the bed around me and screamed, "You think you are better than me," over and over. I was sobbing and all I could think about was going home. I was so scared and I begged her mom to let me call my parents because I felt sick. Her mom grabbed my chin, looked me in the eyes, and said, "I know what you're doing, little girl, and you aren't going anywhere until I say you can." She stormed out of the room, slamming the half-broken bedroom door behind her. Yanni said nothing, and neither did I. Needless to say, I did not sleep that night. In the morning when I went to call my mom, Yanni's mom was on the phone. She wouldn't let me use it, even though I asked multiple times. Finally, she was going to take a shower and I heard her pass the phone off to Yanni's sister and say, "Don't let that little bitch use this phone. If you do, I ain't buying you cigarettes anymore." I was a sheltered kid at the time, but when I overheard that, I knew I had to get out of there. I approached Yanni's sister and she basically threw the phone at me. She was ready to give it to me before I asked for it. With a look of fear in her eyes, she said, "My mom is calling her guy, so you need to call your home, now." And so I did. She saved my life, and I still believe that to this day. Was her guy someone who was going to get rid of me? I shudder at the thought. The rest of the story isn't very exciting. My mom picked me up. I acted like nothing was wrong. 2 days later, it was Parents' Day in school. Yanni was in my class, which meant her mom was there. Her mom approached me and asked me why I never wanted to come over anymore and accused me of being a mean girl. She talked to me in a way that seemed harmless, therefore wasn't obvious to my mom or my teacher. I kept my mouth shut and didn't say a word. Well, until 2 weeks later. My older sister was babysitting me while our parents were at the movies, and I broke down and told her what happened because I couldn't stop thinking about it. She comforted me and told my parents. We hugged each other and we cried. A couple weeks later, Yanni stopped coming to school. My classmates wondered what happened, and so did I. I didn't want to ask my parents what happened. 15 years later, I heard from Yanni on Facebook. There was no life-changing conversation, but we exchanged pleasantries. That's life sometimes. About 10 years ago, when I was 15, my Auntie Jo, best friend Lynn, and I decided on a whim to have a sleepover. We had gathered in my Nan's/Joe's house and were watching films, eating pizza and snacks, and it got to around 11 p.m., so we decided to stay over instead of going home. We went to bed around midnight and decided to all stay in Joe's double bed, top and tail. We didn't go to sleep straight away, of course. We were gossiping and messing around, as teenage girls do. It got to around 1 a.m. and we decided to try to sleep, so we turned out the lights and got into bed. We still didn't sleep right away. We were making jokes and laughing in the dark while fighting over the quilt. Joe's room is on the first floor, so upstairs, which I think is second floor to the US folk, and it's laid out in this way. Walk in the door, the bed and window are straight ahead of you with the top end of the bed against the wall with the window on it. I was sleeping that end, so my head was at the wall end, while Joe and Lynn slept the other way around with a view of the window. I was slowly beginning to drift off to sleep, but kept hearing this noise that sounded a bit like something scraping the wall outside. I tried to ignore it, but it kept me awake, so I laid in the dark with my eyes open and waited for exhaustion to take over. All of a sudden, Joe screamed, jumped out of the bed, and said, "Get away from the window." Lynn then screamed, and I looked at the window to see what was happening and saw the silhouette of a person with their arms raised. We ran downstairs screaming for my Nan, who rushed out from the living room to see what all the noise was. Joe was crying at this point while Lynn and I were just in shock, and we each tried to explain what had just happened. Once we finally got it out, my Nan called the police and went upstairs with a bat to see if the person was still there. They weren't. The police turned up and took our statements, checked the area and came up with nothing, but gave us another number to call should anything suspicious happen or the guy return. We decided to sleep downstairs instead of going back up to Joe's room. We were panicked and frightened, but Joe was still in a state. Lynn and I tried to calm her down and comfort her by saying he was gone and we could call the police if he came back, but Joe looked us both in the eyes and told us something that makes my skin crawl when I think about it now. See, Joe lives in this big Victorian-style house in a quiet area, and while there is a roof right beneath her window, she always locks the window before sleeping and the lock is easily visible. This person, this guy, climbed up the roof and tried to open Joe's window. The guy had his arms raised though, which confused me until Joe told me that her window can open both ways, and she often opened it from the top instead of the bottom. The guy had clearly been watching the house for at least a day and had decided to strike that night, but luckily we had been having the sleepover and saw him. Had Joe been alone that night, she would have been lying on her bed normally and wouldn't have seen the silhouette.